So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session on diagnostics, which I think we heard a hint at. I had warm-up acts earlier talking about the importance of diagnostics. So I'm Fiona Carragher. I'm the Deputy Chief Scientific Officer for the NHS in England. And with that role gives us great privilege because we provide the professional leadership for all the scientists and engineers that work in the NHS. And there's about 50,000 of them. Often a very hidden workforce, but anything from medical physicists to geneticists to cardiovascular scientists will all come under our kind of professional umbrella. I'm also a diagnostician, so I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists. My background is in clinical biochemistry. And I've had the privilege of leading the UK government work on diagnostics and antimicrobial resistance over the last year. So I'm going to tell you about that work and tell you about some of the areas that we're focusing on and really begin to sort of show you how diagnostics is one of the really important ways in which we're going to tackle this global challenge. So that's one of the key messages, is diagnostics being part of that tripartite with infection prevention and control and antibiotic prescribing. Diagnostic stewardship is the way in which we're going to tackle this challenge. So we heard earlier, and I think just to kind of set the scene again, we know that we're getting a significant number of increasingly development of a rapid spread of multi-drug resistant bacteria. And what we know also is that the antibiotics that we currently have are becoming less effective. Bacteria, fungal and viruses are naturally adapting and becoming increasingly resistant. And as Nick Brown showed us really eloquently this morning, this is at a time where we've got an all-time low in new antibiotics being developed. So a real kind of hotspot of real challenges around this. One of the things about this whole conference today, which I think is absolutely fantastic, is that we are bringing the different professions, the different disciplines together, because this cannot be done by one single group, one single discipline alone. This has to be how we bring together our veterinary professionals with our medical professionals, and that's across all the different hospital professionals, but also thinking about the environment as well. And I think that's one thing we've probably not touched upon so much during the day, but I think going into the future, the environmental piece is going to be really important as well. So I think this morning we briefly heard about the Lord O'Neill report. And Lord O'Neill is an economist, one of the leading economists in Europe, and he was asked by the Cameron government to do an independent review from an economic perspective. Actually, there seems to be lots of people coming in. Come in, and then I'll carry on.
Diagnostics workshop, is that right?
Everyone want diagnostics?
Sorry, Fiona, they went to the wrong room, but they were coming to...
Oh, brilliant. Come on in. Oh, this is good. I like this. Is that everybody?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Right, so just to kind of briefly recap. So I'm Fiona. I'm the Deputy Chief Scientific Officer for the NHS in England. So we lead all the scientists and engineers that work in the NHS. But also, I am a diagnostician by background, so I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists, and I've worked in laboratories and led big laboratories across the country. So I'm going to talk to you about diagnostics. And I think where I got to was saying that Lord O'Neill, who's an economist, was asked by the government about 18 months, 2 years ago, to do a big independent review of the global burden of antimicrobial resistance. And what O'Neill showed, and he was very much looking from an economic perspective, he showed that by 2050 there would be more deaths from resistant infections than there would be from cancer. And actually, the cost, the economic burden of this would be phenomenal, 66 trillion, which I can't get my head around in some ways in terms of the number of noughts that would mean. But a significant global burden. And what's interesting with the O'Neill work is that we'd had a government strategy since 2013 that was looking about how we prevent infections, how we protect the drugs that we have, and how we promote the use of the development of new drugs and diagnostics. But on the back of the O'Neill response, the government then set some very clear ambitions for the UK. Now, the UK government has led the world, and I think we heard this earlier under Dame Sally Davis, who's the Chief Medical Officer. She's really given such enormous global leadership in this and has set the bar really high in terms of the agenda across the world. But on the back of the O'Neill report, the government then set out some very clear ambitions. The first was about halving the amount of healthcare-associated gram-negative bloodstream infections, so a human health focus. And we heard earlier from John around the animal health focus with the reducing of the animal use. Now, diagnostics was always part of the 2013 strategy for AMR, so always part of what we could do, but no one had really got to grips with, well, what is it we have to get on and do? And although there had been some thinking around this, there wasn't really a proper programme of work. And this all changed with the O'Neill report, because it's really worth looking at, and particularly if you are interested in the diagnostic agenda, he put out a separate, much smaller report on diagnostics. And the bottom line was, he said, you're missing a trick. If you're not thinking about diagnostics in this agenda, you are missing a trick. Because basically, at the moment, we're flying blind with a lot of the treatment decisions. We're empirically treating with antibiotics on the basis of symptomology. We're not actually properly being able to drive the appropriate use of antimicrobials. So what O'Neill said in his report is that we needed a step change in the way that technology is incorporated into our clinical decision-making process. Now, in the NHS, it takes, on average, 17 years from a great idea, so that amazing science we heard this morning, to be routine practice across the NHS. That's at best, really. It can take a lot longer than that. But we know we need to get much more streamlined in the way in which we invent, evaluate, and then adopt into clinical practice. What O'Neill also said is that there's real opportunity from thinking about rapid point-of-care diagnostics. So this might be pen-side when we think about the animal health agenda, or bedside, or in a GP or a community pharmacy setting. So point-of-care diagnostics is, when we think about diagnostics, is the things that are done outside of the big laboratories by non-laboratory professionals. So at the moment, if you went to my old labs at St Thomas's, cutting-edge technology, if you're in the hospital, you will get amazing diagnostic support. But you will have a very different offer of support if you're a GP down in Lambeth, when you're making decisions day on day, hour by hour with the patients that you're seeing. There's no diagnostic support or offer for you. So part of what O'Neill was saying, and what we're now recognising, is that if we have point of care where that decision is made, then that is really going to help in the way in which we use our antimicrobials. And what's interesting is that Lord O'Neill gave a very strong statement of push, really, to governments across the world. He said that by 2020, there shouldn't be an antibiotic prescription given unless it is informed by a diagnostic when we have it. Now, no governments across the world have taken up that challenge. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the reasons why, and some of the reasons why it's really hard to do. But I think that that pressure is still on to think about, actually, where we do have diagnostics, that should be, used before we actually prescribe. So in very simple terms, where could diagnostics be used? They could be there to tell us whether the infection is bacterial or viral, to tell us what type of bacteria it is, tell us what the resistance mechanisms are, so what I shouldn't be given, what are they susceptible to, so what shall I use. But we increasingly realise that there's a really important role for host response biomarkers. So this is thinking about us as human health and our own response to that infection. So how do we respond? And there's some really new and not so new diagnostics that are coming through that are based on the premise of host response biomarkers. Now currently, this nirvana of all of that in a point of care test within a few minutes that can be used in a GP clinic or beside the pen in a farm doesn't exist. And I think that's probably one of the big reasons why this has been such a challenge, because we currently don't have the diagnostic repertoire that can do this where it's needed at the moment. So as I said right at the beginning, I've worked in the NHS since I left university, and in all that time I've worked in laboratories. I'm a diagnostician, that's my bread and butter. And so my big last clinical role was Director of Biochemical Sciences at Guy's and St Thomas's. And diagnostics pretty much cut across every single care pathway, be it from cancer, from mental health, from cardiovascular disease. Diagnostics are going to play their part across all those different care pathways. And what they have the ability to do is to really triage patients and people to the right place at the right time. So it ensures our treatment is effective and efficient. But they also have an ability for us to triage and actually prioritise activity, to say, actually, we're confident that we don't need to treat this patient acutely, the diagnostics are helped us here. And that, from a health and economic perspective, is really, really important, because it means that our resources are used appropriately, and actually we can screen or we can triage using a diagnostic. So only those that really need to go on for further investigation or further treatment actually happen to do so. So on the back of the O'Neill work about 18 months ago, the UK government realised that actually there was much more they needed to do around the diagnostic agenda. And although there'd been big steps forward in infection prevention and control, big steps forward in antibiotic prescribing, both of which Nick showed you this morning, and also big steps forward in animal health use of antibiotics, very little had been done on the diagnostics agenda, and much of it because of the challenges around it. So we were asked at the end of last year as the CSO office in NHS England to lead on behalf of the whole of the UK a big programme of work around diagnostics. And in its simplest terms, what we're looking for is to maximise the use of really high quality value. So I'm going to talk to you about what value means here in terms of diagnostic technology. So the diagnostic offer should be rapid and flexible, tailored to the setting. So what you need in a big acute hospital like St Thomas's is going to be very different from what you would need in a pharmacy practice down in Cornwall, what the offer is. But actually, wherever that diagnostic is offered, it should be high quality, it should be accurate, it should be precise. We should have confidence that the people doing the test are trained, and we should have confidence that the result means what it should do. We also know that there's a big amount of work that needs to go on around the innovation agenda, because we know that we're not streamlined or lined up from that great idea to adoption in the NHS. So when we come to what we're focusing on, at the moment, the majority of our diagnostics, and I'm very focused on NHS at the moment, the diagnostics currently are in what we would call secondary or hospital care. So that's the big kind of hospitals. So most hospitals across the country will have microbiology laboratories or will have access to microbiology laboratories. We've also got a really amazing world-leading infrastructure around public health with our Public Health England laboratories. So these are places like Colindale and Portendale, you know, the world experts in. So we have got very, very good infrastructure around the hospital setting, amazing infrastructure around public health. What we don't have is very much out of those settings. So very, very little done in primary or GP practices or in community care. Very little, nothing pretty much done in social care settings. When you think about patients in care homes, for example, very little done there. And very little done or thought about done in terms of very disruptive and new ways of offering diagnostics, either in a pharmacy or in a high street, or in the future around self-care and monitoring. So again, there's a continuum of that setting. But wherever the diagnostic is offered, there's some really important kind of key things that need to happen. The first is that the data, and these are very, very data heavy, diagnostics is very data heavy, the data needs to be able to be linked, which means that we need to be able to standardise it. It means the same thing. We're calling things the same thing. And that's incredibly important, so that what we are actually believing the result as the patient goes through this pathway, and actually we can link those results at a national level from a sort of a surveillance perspective as well. Now, diagnostics, I would say there's a jigsaw at the moment and it isn't all put together. And in some ways, it's wonderful to be able to speak to this community of students because you will see, I'm sure, a step change in the use of technology and diagnostics through your professional careers. At the moment, we've got real challenges in the way in which we can use these technologies or even get these technologies. When we talk about standards, this is how we ensure the quality of that diagnostic offer. So that we do have national standards, they're called the UK Standards of Microbiology Investigation, but we know that there's huge variation across the country in how they're used and how they're adopted. So again, some standards exist, but not everyone's using them. We also know that we've got real challenges in inappropriate use of diagnostics. So I'm going to come on to that in a little while, but really simple diagnostic tests, such as urinary dipsticks, are not used appropriately, and that's also important. We also know that we've got a really complex way in which we're able or unable to commission or buy diagnostics in the NHS. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. But basically, it's very, very difficult to do something, particularly out of a hospital setting, because of the money and the money flows behind it. So on the back of the work that we were asked to do, we established a big programme of work. And I'm not going to go into the detail of this particularly, but it was a point that I wanted to pick up from this morning. The only way that we're going to make a step change in this is if we work together. This has to be about collaboration, this has to be about multi-professional, interdisciplinary, working with others across the system are going to make that step change. And we heard that in the animal health area, that's how they were able to do it. It's not through kind of mandation from a national government level, it has to be about how we come together. So we've established the UKAMR Diagnostic Collaborative, and it is that sort of sense of everyone who's got an interest or a piece to do on this comes together, so we do it together and we do it once and we do it really, really well. And our work is really focused on a few big things, and I'm going to go into detail around diagnostic stewardship so you understand that concept going away, and also around innovation, because I think that's the future of where things may go. But I just want to talk to you briefly about value, because this is really, really important, and one of the reasons that it's ever so challenging to get new diagnostics into care settings. When we think about value, it's how we think about cost, but also about the impact of that sort of decision to use something. And if you think about primary care and you think about a GP who's going to prescribe, many of the antibiotics they're prescribing are generic and they're going to be very cheap. They're going to be like pence and pounds. Whereas a diagnostic, for us to put like a little sort of bench-side testing kit, is going to be 10, 15, 20 pounds plus. So it's very difficult to make that economic argument just about how we actually use that diagnostic in that different care setting. So a lot of the work that we're doing currently is thinking about, well, actually, do we need to think differently about this? Do we need to think about the value of that more expensive diagnostic in primary care, but it means that for the care pathway or for the patient, further down the line, we won't have hospital admissions, or actually for society as a whole. And that's quite challenging when it comes to making that economic argument. But the value of diagnostics is one of the biggest things that we need to consider. So I'm going to talk to you about diagnostic stewardship and about innovation, because I think they're kind of key messages to take home. So when it comes to diagnostic stewardship, and I think Nick Brown sort of hinted at this morning, my take-home message for today and for you walking into your professional careers in the future is that there's a tripartite approach to how we're going to tackle this challenge of antimicrobial resistance. Absolutely, we need the infection prevention and control. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We need to focus on appropriate antibiotic prescribing. But to do that and support that, we need diagnostic stewardship. And in the UK, we have established a definition of diagnostic stewardship based on the WHO version. But this is all to do with having coordinated professional guidance and interventions. So how do we understand our patient? How do we understand the care that we need to give them? And we can do this by clinical assessment and scoring algorithms and diagnostic testing. So we bring that all together to help us guide our therapeutic decisions or screening strategies. It's really, really important to not just think about this as a test that's done in the lab, but really think about the whole end-to-end pathway from making sure it's the appropriate sample that's collected, it's timely, it's needed, it's accurate, but also that the results are given and we're using them to help guide clinical care. We also know that there's an important piece about don't do the things we know we shouldn't be doing, and we're not very good at doing that. We continue to use diagnostic tests that aren't of value. But there's a key piece in this in terms of data and how we use that data to really help inform local surveillance, local guidance and local improvement as well. So that's why I go back to, it doesn't matter where that diagnostic is done in the future, where the test setting is, it's really important that we're still able to collate that data from a surveillance perspective as well. So, as I say, I've worked in laboratories for most of my professional career, and in the lab, we tend to think of, we're very focused on what's done within the laboratory. So once the sample gets to the lab, how quickly we can turn it around, the high quality pieces of kit that we're using, that's a big focus of what we do. But the whole point about this, and diagnostic stewardship, is that it has to be the whole end-to-end pathway, right from the moment the patient presents and you're deciding what you think it may be, what tests you need to do, what sample you need to collect. All of this, what I would describe as pre-analytical, is incredibly important, because rubbish in, you will get rubbish out, and you won't be able to get a diagnostic result that's going to help properly inform your clinical decision. So a lot of important work, and I think really important work for the laboratory professionals to think outside their lab walls and make sure that they are working with clinical teams across both the hospital and the community settings to make sure that the appropriate sample collection is done in the first place. The second piece at the end of it is about ensuring that the reporting and it's wrapped into clinical decision making. So again, it doesn't matter how fast and whizzy and amazing your testing is if no one's acting upon the results. And in many cases, and not just in infectious diseases, in many cases those results don't go anywhere, or if they go anywhere they'll go into a patient record and no one's acting upon them. So we need to be really clear about how these results are acted upon as well. So a big part of this is the laboratory professionals being part of that multi-professional team with infection prevention and control and with antibiotic prescribing. So we're focusing this year on 3 big areas, and I want to tell you about this because these will give you an idea of some of the areas that are really important here and now. The first is about the use of biomarkers. So this is the host response to infection, where we've got only one diagnostic that has gone through NICE evaluation, and this is C-reactive proteins. I'll just tell you a little bit about that. The second is about improving the blood culture pathway. So again, Nick Brown talked about the 48 to 72 hour review. Really important to get that blood culture pathway right. So I'll just talk to you briefly about that. And finally, a focus on inappropriate testing, where we know there's a significant amount of inappropriate urinary dipstick testing happening, particularly in care homes. So CRP is the only infectious disease biomarker that has gone through NICE approval. And that's important for the NHS because for us to say in the NHS, yes, we should be doing it, it needs to come having had a NICE evaluation and NICE support for its use. So CRP has been shown to be effective in helping triage and diagnose patients with pneumonia, adults in primary care. And this has been wrapped into the guidance for pneumonia, saying that if you've got a patient with lower respiratory tract infection, CRP point of care testing, so there are bench-side pieces of kit, can really help your decision making. And there's very clear cut-offs of what you do and clear algorithms of how you then treat and make decisions about your patient care. What we do know is that there's significant variation. Even though this has come out in the last year or so, hardly any centres, if any, are routinely doing this out in primary care. And there's a whole host of reasons for this. Not least that it's very difficult again for the commissioners or for decision makers about the money to make that economic argument. Very, very difficult. We also know that there's issues about training and supporting the non-laboratory professionals to be providing this testing, and essentially having that quality wraparound of the result. So big piece of work we've done over the last few months is to really understand what's going on, so that at a national level we can try and drive and support and really try and get stuff that goes over these barriers. Because we know this was at the end of last year, there's probably about 45 pilot sites all trying to do it in their own way to try and adopt this technology across the country. And I think this kind of shows the example of why diagnostics has been really challenging, is because until we set up the programme in the last year, there was no national oversight of this, no national guidance, no national support for them to do it. They're all trying individually to adopt CRP point of care testing. So over the next few months, you'll see a lot more coming out from the NHS England and our work to try and make this happen at a local level in a much more robust way. The second point I want to talk to you about is inappropriate testing, which is just as important as appropriate diagnostic testing. And we know that in care homes, and particularly for our frail elderly population and the management of UTIs, that we've got real significant inappropriate use of really simple dipstick testing. So they're done, and then they're making decisions on that, assuming that a patient's got a UTI, and then giving them an inappropriate antimicrobial. So there's a big focus of work happening now after some very, very exciting pilots that showed a real difference of using this approach to actually support care home staffs and GPs with support from local pharmacists to use appropriate dipstick testing and to get the right urinary sample sent to the laboratory for culture and sensitivity. And this has taken a real quality improvement approach, so really bottom up, helping clinicians understand what they should be doing. And what it's shown in the pilot sites across Bath and North East Somerset, that it really did improve appropriate management of urinary tract infection. A phenomenal number of residents, the numbers were reduced in terms of prescribed antibiotics, and a significant, like 67% reduction in the number of prescriptions for antibiotics. I mean, unbelievable impact on both the care of those individual people in the care home, but actually for this broad antimicrobial stewardship piece. And what they also showed was that by focusing on this, they also improved the management of catheter-associated UTIs and led to a reduction in E. coli bloodstream infections. So simple tests that are often used bedside, GP practice, but in this setting, in a care home setting, were leading to dramatic inappropriate prescribing. And by not using them, by using them in the right way, significant changes. So again, a key message going back is that this is not just about the right test, it's about not using a test when it's not going to be effective. And then finally, I wanted to talk to you about blood cultures, and this is really focused in the hospital environment. So really thinking about that 48 to 72 hour review. So we've talked about the start smart, so acutely ill patient, get them on antibiotics, but actually that 48 to 72 hour review is incredibly important because it's then about step down or go from broad spectrum to more targeted. And to do that, you really do need that diagnostic result to help you make those much more targeted decisions, so personalised treatment at that point. And what we know is that there's significant variation in blood culture pathways across this country. That's through local and some regional audit. And we know that if we were able to optimise the blood culture pathway, we know that it'd help in terms of sepsis. It absolutely helps in terms of antimicrobial stewardship. It can lead to a reduced length of stay for patients in hospital and ultimately to improved outcomes and financial savings. And when you think about the blood culture pathway, and this is what I was saying about, it's not just about what's done in the lab, it's about the appropriate sample that's collected in the first place. So for a patient, the clock starts from when they come in and they have that first assessment and their blood culture done. There's a whole big piece about it goes in transport to the lab, and if any of you have worked in big acute hospitals, you know that portering, it might sit around for days, it might take minutes, but it might take a long time to get to the laboratory. Then you've got a whole load of stuff that needs to be done in the laboratory. And we know that we've got very, very clear standards, national standards about what should be happening, but we also know that through local audit that there's been huge variation. And there's some simple things we can do. The first is that it's about education. Education to collect the right samples, to make sure that those samples get to the laboratory in a timely manner. And where we don't have microbiology services on site, and in some hospitals that doesn't happen, actually how can we think differently about making sure those samples are getting prepared? So using other parts of pathology that work 24 shift system to start processing. So actually, rather than waiting to the Monday morning for the micro staff to come in, we've started the process ahead of time. And our work nationally, we are on Monday going live with the first ever UK-wide audit and survey of blood culture practice. We've got national guidance that says what we should be doing, and we're going out to all of the UK, to all the UK laboratories, to find out where the variation in practice is. So that begins to give us a really good view of what it looks like and how we actually then start to improve it. So I've talked about the here and now. So diagnostic stewardship, what we've focused on so far are the diagnostics we've currently got and getting really good with what we should be doing now, because we know there's variation. I think the exciting bit to the future is where new technology is going to take us. And this, particularly when we start to think about kind of a One Health agenda, is where some of the really big step changes and disruptive technology will take us. Now, so I've described I am a biochemist by background, and in my time in the NHS, when I started in biochemistry, we used to do proper old-fashioned bucket chemistry, so big sort of thin-layered chromatography, big banks of solvents, paper chromatography, and you had a blob on the paper, you knew that there was something wrong with that baby. Now, whole genome sequencing, mass spectrometry, metabolomic type approaches, step changes in my small part of science. And we know in this arena, in AMR and infectious diseases, the technology is evolving at pace. So when we are now having, handheld lab-on-a-chip type nanotechnology, which means that your smartphone may be able to do some of the diagnostics that would currently be done in the big laboratories in the big hospitals like at St Thomas's. I've already talked about the point-of-care testing devices that we have already evaluated for CRP. There's many more of those coming. But also we need to be thinking about the different settings for that technology and how that disrupts our care pathways. And then the whole throughput genomic technologies, the use of whole genome sequencing, is now becoming standard practice in the NHS, being brought into the big public health laboratories, being brought into some of the big genomic laboratories. But in this arena, it's not that many steps forward, so that you actually have point-of-care testing that's able to do whole genome sequencing with significant, rapid step changes in technology. And what's interesting, and I think which is what is really exciting for you guys in this audience, is that in the future it's going to be so disruptive, and we're going to have to learn at pace and think very differently and learn from other sectors. So where is this approach of big data, clinical decision making, surveillance, artificial intelligence going to take us? Could it put us on the front foot of this challenge? But underpinning that goes back down to my very statement that we have to believe the data, and that data has to be interoperable, and it has to be standardised and of high quality. Again, rubbish in, rubbish out. I think there's huge opportunities for us to learn across the animal health sector, and we're beginning to look at this from a diagnostic perspective, working with both human and animal and environmental groups and academics to really say, actually, what does the technology look like that could cut across these different environments? What's the learning? And I think one of the things we do need to learn from is what's happening in other countries across the world. In the UK, we're blessed with very good infrastructure. In the NHS, we've got very big microbiology laboratories, we've got the Public Health England laboratories, the big surveillance labs. But actually, much of the disruptive technology is being adopted in low and middle income countries where they just don't have that. They've got to do something else. They've got to do something differently. So I think part of our role and part of your learning for the future will be actually keeping an eye on working and collaborating internationally as well. And I think what's so exciting about this conference, and again, I suppose one message to me going out, is that if you stay in your silos, if you stay in your pharmacy, medicine, biochemistry, veterinary side, we're never going to make that step change. So it absolutely has to be working and collaborating and learning from each other. Some of the most exciting things I've done in my career have been working with engineers that have had nothing to do with my clinical specialism at all. But it's how you collaborate at the boundaries of specialisms. And with innovation, it's got to be how we bring this all together. And we certainly see this in terms of our views that you bring together academia, our industry colleagues, looking internationally, working across into the animal and environmental health piece, but also putting the patients and the users of the service at the heart of this. But what's interesting, because I've put at the bottom a kind of a simple diagram that explains what the innovation pipeline looks like. So innovate, get your great idea, evaluate it, show it works, demonstrate the impact of it, and then adopt to make sure it goes across the whole of the care settings. And I've already said that takes 17 years at best in the NHS. We need to be much better at that. We need to be match fit at the end, waiting and ready for the disruptive technology to come in. Ideally, we need to be collaborating with the inventors at the beginning. So actually, they're working on things that are really needed, so we're ready to adopt them at the end. A lot of work needs to go on to make this much more streamlined. And that's something that we're recognising. I'm not going to tell you the detail of this, but just to say that one of the big things that we're doing now is to bring all those innovators together and say, what does it look like? What are your problems? How are you trying to navigate this really complex environment? So that at the end, we really understand that what is it we need to do to make this step change happen. And what's interesting, again, I think Nick set the scene this morning, is that the UK government through Sally Davies has definitely led the world in a lot of this. And we've had a strategy for the last 5 years. A lot of work gone on over the last few months to develop a new strategy that will be launched in the new year. And this very much gives if it goes ahead as it's planned, we'll have a much longer vision, a 20-year vision, and then a 5-year plan underneath it. But to do that, to make that step change, it has to be about bringing it all together across humans, animal, food, and the environment. And having seen and been involved in the writing of this, diagnostics, from being quite a Cinderella story in the original 2013 strategy, is now firmly there, firmly focused. So you'll probably be hearing a lot more about diagnostics coming into the next few years. And again, as Nick has said, there's political pressure on this. It hasn't gone away. The Health and Select Committee released a report in the last few weeks. And from a diagnostic perspective, they're putting a big challenge on us to say, look, if there are diagnostics available and they've gone through evaluation at NICE, we need to make sure that we are looking at how we finance this and how we look at the value and how we actually are able to make these adopted into the NHS. So again, a big focus on diagnostics in the political arena as well. So I'm not going to go into detail just before I finish, but I suppose to say is that the work that we're doing around diagnostics has been about bringing people together and providing that leadership. And where we have things what we should be doing, like blood cultures, like urinary dipsticks, like CRP, we're cracking on and doing it, and we're making that happen. But actually, for the future, it's about how the whole of that system comes together. And what's been a real privilege, and I think interestingly, I'm due to leave the NHS in the next few weeks to go and work at one of the big major research charities to focus on dementia. And my learning has been, and I'd like to share this with you guys in this room, is that the big things and the big difference you can make are when you actually collaborate and work with others. And be quite brave. I often describe myself as a bungee jumping biochemist, to make those collaborations and partnerships with people that you might not necessarily think are going to make a difference to what you want to work for. So the work that we've done here over the last year has been about collaboration. And that's what it's got to be about. We're not going to do this in our silos. We're not going to do this as individual professions. It's got to be about how we work in partnership. So I just wanted to leave you with that thought, but again, open for questions around diagnostics or particularly around the work that we're doing or the UK government.